So we're going to be discussing why people are not turning Conservative today. But I am just going to pick out, there's a little question here of interest because it's sort of current. I've lost it now. It's about Keir Starmer and the Liaison Committee. Oh yes, one angry pagan there saying, just watching the PM answer questions at the Liaison Committee, many of his answers sound very non-committal, not great. It can't be any way other than that. I'll go. So for those who don't know, the Liaison Committee is a cross-party group of MPs whose job it is to quiz specifically the Prime Minister. So like you have different select committees. You have the Home Affairs Select Committee who quizzes the Home Secretary on Home Office issues. Foreign Affairs Select Committee who quizzes the Foreign Secretary on foreign issues, things like that. So the Liaison Committee is specifically asking the Prime Minister what he's up to. And at the normally what you would do is you would go, oh, you know, you had this as your big project. This is the result. How do you think it's going? What are you going to do about this? None of that's really happening now because the government's very new. So there isn't really a record to press Starmer on. There isn't a full suite of details of lots of policies. So all they can ask, and I've been watching a bit of Liaison Committee myself, all they can ask for is like, so what are you going to do? They're asking for details about things that haven't been announced yet. But it's like, well, they haven't been announced yet. So that means either they haven't been decided or they've only just been decided and they haven't yet announced them to MPs. Give you an example. So the budget was only announced, what, 7 weeks ago? And so that was the first time cabinet ministers really had a handle on how much money they were going to have. So now they're spending their time trying to work out. So they already had their priorities. They had their policies that they were going to put in place. But now they have to allocate that money. So, and I'm going to do a video on this for my 7 p.m. one tonight, for example. So it was announced there was going to be an extra £233 million next year for tackling homelessness, right? So that was a fairly big boost of money. But it didn't say when the budget was announced exactly where that money was going to go. This week, I think it was yesterday, Angela Rayner has announced exactly how that money's being divided up, because until the money was allocated, you know, you couldn't say what you were going to spend it on. So then you work on the details. So the same thing's happening. So that's the reason why any answers at the Liaison Committee now are going to be non-committal, because nothing's really, the government's too new. You know, they can't ask them about things that have been done because nothing's really been done. So they're trying to ask questions about what specifically he's going to do, but it's like, well, we haven't made the decision yet, or haven't announced the decision. So, but anyway, on to today's little question, which was posted in the little request for questions I put up a while ago. And it goes, how can we prove to some older people who are convinced we'll turn sensible and vote Tory when you're older, since they don't seem to understand the massive demographic shift with how much the Tories and right-wing politics have screwed over younger generations? So, it is a good question. And it's natural for older people to think you're going to turn sensible and vote Tory later on, because that's what generally people have done, and they've done it all around the world as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go over sorry, Wanga Peg was just that I'm not going to do any videos about Labour's plans for devolution. I had actually planned to do one. I will at some point. I have to be a little bit careful because it's one of those very dull subjects. But I had actually thought about doing it this week. I may still at some point next week. But at some point, yes, inevitably when things are announced, I will probably every now and then do some discussion on it. But yeah, so the reason why people generally turn more conservative as they get older, not everyone, but a good chunk of people, is effectively because of capitalism, essentially, I suppose. You know, you're in your 20s. I'll do it empirically, but then I've got data. It's always nice to have data, you know, little graphs. Some of which I've used in previous videos, some of which I'm not sure I have. So we'll go through them. But the general feeling is, so when you start the world of work and you're the poorest you're ever going to be, right? You're getting the lowest wage, you're bottom of the heap in terms of salary, but you've also got the highest costs because you're probably renting. Even if you've managed to live at home for a bit to save up a deposit, some people have that. Some people's parents are able to let them live there rent free while they put money aside to save up for a deposit for a house. But even if that's the case, your initial mortgage payments are going to be very high because you're going to get the biggest mortgage you can. with the idea being that even if interest rates go up or down a little bit, you know, in 10 years' time, as a proportion of your income, your mortgage payment's going to be much smaller than it was when you first got it. So when you first get it, so when you first move out, whether it's renting or getting a mortgage, you're paying a lot of your income, a high proportion of your income on housing. And then, of course, you've still got all the other bills as well. You may, for example, not be able to afford a very good car. So you may, just because you have to pay for what you can, you may have to get a bit of a banger, which then ends up costing you quite a lot in the long run with repairs and maintenance and things like that. So there's all sorts of extra costs when you're young. But the idea is for middle class people who get onto the housing ladder, like I say, 10 years time, your mortgage payment now is nowhere near as much. 20 years time, you're actually coming towards the end of your mortgage. You've got your eye on that. You've presumably climbed the ladder of your career, so you're now earning quite a lot more. You're paying much less on housing. You've maybe had your kids, maybe they're getting ready to be booted out of the family home. So you're looking at a future in the next 10 years whereby you've got a lot more money coming in. You're able to put some money aside for saving. You're starting maybe to think, my job may be paying well, but it's crap, I hate it, I want to retire early. So you start being a bit covetous and you start going, oh yeah, we like the NHS and we like, you know, other public services. Of course we want that. But the Conservatives are promising to give us all that and at lower taxes. Oh, if I paid lower taxes, yeah, I'll have even more money to put aside so I can retire earlier from my well-paid but crap job. So that's the way it works. And so then you become naturally more conservative as you get older. And then once you're like pension age, and Conservatives are all about the pensioners, then you start to feel that they are the natural party backing your side. But it's no longer happening. So let's go through the sort of general proof of this. So first of all, this was in the Financial Times a couple of years ago, and I've used this a few times. This is for, so what have we got? We've got the UK on the left and the United States on the right, because it's a similar thing, offset slightly because we've had progressive governments at different times. So obviously these sort of trends tend to develop during Conservative governments. So Conservative Party in this country, Republicans in America, which aren't always aligned. In fact, they're usually not aligned. But what you can see in the UK, so you've got, you know, the boomer generation, which is like the, you know, the one that's belly aches the most, even though they've had the most. They're the ones who've benefited the most from capitalism, probably in human history, right? So they turned conservative pretty sharply as they reached retirement age. Generation X, you can sort of see a little bit behind the curve, but they sort of catch up by the time they're getting towards 60. But then you see millennials. Complete, you know, they're way down on this. They don't look, okay, at the moment, they're only sort of getting into their 40s. So is this graph before the US election? Yeah, this is 2 years ago. But you can see that millennials are showing no interest at all. And admittedly, they're sort of only just in their 40s here. So you'd have to see how it goes on. But at the moment, you're looking at it and you're thinking, this is a completely different. And you can see in America, millennials start to follow the same pattern as everyone else, but then turn sharply. They've now turned sharply and they're going the other direction. So although it's a different trend, you've still got the same thing in both the United States and the United Kingdom. You've got millennials who are not really showing much interest as they enter middle age of tending towards becoming more conservative. Now, that is just your starter for 10. Let us have a look at how it works in Europe, because you think to yourself, okay, well, if you've got, okay, it's not quite the same trend, but you've got a similar thing in the United States and in the UK. Is this across other countries as well? No. So here we've got some other countries in Europe. And what this shows at the top is that people sort of abandoning, this is the percentage of people, by the way, that vote for conservative parties by age, right? Again, this is like not since this is a couple of years ago as well, I think, or maybe a year ago, but it's before the elections this year. And you can see that you know, at the very older age, sure, you've got a similar proportion vote Conservative parties in the UK as the United States, a little bit, you know, Australia, stuff like that, and the Netherlands. But at the younger end, it's much lower. It's a much lower percentage. So this is literally by age, the percentage of people who vote Conservative. So you've got this huge disparity based on age. So it's the older ones, yes, vote Conservative, majority vote Conservative. But at the younger end, it's like next to nothing. And this isn't seen in other comparable countries in Europe. So what's the reason for this? Well, let us have a look at the next one. Let's get rid of that. So the first obvious one is home ownership. And this is what I said before. You know, people getting onto the housing ladder so that in 20 years' time, the amount they're paying on housing proportion is basically the same as it was 20 years earlier. So proportionally, as a, you know, as part of their income, because their income has gone up in real terms, but also inflation, everything like that means that their mortgage payments are really low. Whereas if you're renting at the same time, your rent may well be 4 times what this homeowner's mortgage payment is. So the fact that younger people have not been able to get onto the housing ladder as easily means that you've got a lot of people now entering their 40s who are renting more than a higher proportion than used to be the case, because the Conservatives didn't build enough new houses. Now, why didn't they? Given that the Conservatives get their votes from homeowners, and they know that, why didn't they make more homeowners? And this is where they got themselves into a bit of a trap, and they knew they were walking into this trap. George Osborne knew he was walking into this trap, because what he said apparently to his Liberal Democrat colleagues about, well, why aren't we building more houses? He would say to them, because existing homeowners don't want us to. So the Tories were in this trap. If they build more new houses, then they're creating homeowners for the future. So they're because who's going to buy those homes? It's people in their 20s and 30s, right? If you build enough homes, then it's people mostly in their 20s. If they're going to get on the housing ladder, they're going to get the housing ladder in their 20s, right? If you've got enough housing stock. So they're still too young to be thinking about voting Conservative. That's more for 20, 30 years' time. So you create your voters for 20, 30 years' time, but you lose votes amongst the existing homeowners because they don't want the housing estates near them. They don't want the building works because they've already got a home. So that's the trap they walked into. And that means that what happened was, over this period of 14 years, they massively reduced the number of people who could get on the housing ladder really very quickly. So they cost themselves all those voters. And that's really what it is, because you can see, compared to other countries, we've got on here the United States, Germany and France. The UK, a massive collapse. Even during Labour's time, you can see here, a massive collapse in the proportion of young adult home ownership. So that's really what did it. Only this is something that is extra ridiculous under the Tories, because the Tories need homeowners to vote for them. Well, Angry Pagan, they're saying, we millennials have had enough of the bullcrap, and millennials, by the way, stretch all the way to 30-year-olds like myself, Phil. It's a bit older now, I think. Master Assassin, they're saying, proud millennial here. Not only have my generation been shat on, but we've watched as our parents' lives have also been shat on. Only they worked hard but didn't reap the same rewards as boomers. No, boomers got everything. I mean, you know, you've got baby boomers. It's not their fault, but you know, they just benefited from that huge surge. They benefit from a few things, like the post-war economy boom. You had women entering the workforce in much larger numbers. Immigration that was boosting our economy. So you had all these things that meant that a nurse or like a police officer or something, some ordinary public servant, could buy a house in they could buy a house in London, for goodness sake. Whereas you can't now. Can't now. Not possible. Not happening. And then there's another one. I've used this chart before. I think there's a chart I haven't really used before that's also, because this is the real killer one. And it's to do with attitudes. So what this shows, let me just zoom it out so I can see more. So what this shows is The blue dot is like it's where people start to feel that hard work pays off. So that's what the blue dot is. It's at what age do you sort of think that hard work pays off is effectively how you could look at that. And what percentage of these sort of different age groups think that. So you can see those age 70 plus in the UK, 60% of them think if you work hard, you'll get the rewards. It's the classic conservative line that if you work hard, you'll get the rewards. For 18 to 29-year-olds, fewer than 40% think that. Now, if you look at other countries, in Germany, it's about the same. Both that young age group, those in their late teens and 20s, and those 70 plus, roughly 50% think that hard work pays off in the end. In the Netherlands, it's the other way around, weirdly. Someone explain that to me. In the Netherlands, young people are more likely to think hard work pays off than older people. Australia, it's the same way around as us, but again, it's, you know, young people are, with all of these other countries, young people are much more likely than in the UK to think hard work can pay off, that you can get your rewards from hard work. So this is to do with attitudes. So you strip out all the reasons for it, and the simple fact of the matter is that a minority of people that are young think that if they work hard, they'll get the rewards. In which case, you will, I mean, there's two ways of looking at it. I mean, imagine you're in that cohort and you fundamentally don't believe that hard work's going to pay off. So first of all, why would you work hard? So then you're, you know, a certain group of people are more likely to just coast through life, thinking, well, what's the point of putting in extra work, doing extra study to try and climb the ladder? There's no point because it's not going to pay off. If you're in a workplace where you just see talentless boobs getting promoted ahead of you all the time, and you're the one doing all the work, so you get all that going on. If I put the question back up, but then there's another thing as well, which sort of came up before as well. The other thing is you may be attracted. You may not take it sitting down. You may decide, well, hang on a minute, this isn't good enough. So what are you going to do about it? Well, if the system as it exists, in your view, doesn't mean that hard work will give you the rewards you expect, then there's something wrong with the system. You will think, well, the system should change. So what are you going to do? You'll be attracted to populism, which goes to what someone said quite early on, that although, if I put this back up, younger generations are not tending towards conservatism as much, some of them are turning towards right-wing populism. Some of them are turning to left-wing populism as well. But, you know, certainly the big danger for us is right-wing populism. I'm not saying that because I'm on the left, but because they're organised and they have money. Like, you know, the Green Party are not going to form a government in this country. I suppose if we had proportional representation, then in a few decades they could build up to that, but they would be a fundamentally different party. They would have to reform themselves, no pun intended, in order to be able to make themselves fit for government. But Reform UK, under either system, could credibly form a government in the next 10 to 20 years. Not the next election, but in the next 10 to 20 years, under either first past the post or proportional representation. It's not beyond the realms of possibility because, of course, they have got access potentially to a lot of money, unless Labour do get serious about funding in politics. And they have instant access to the mainstream media. Videos to address issues for disabled people. Yes, another one I have also got in the works. But I have to be a little bit careful with those ones because those are the ones I'm afraid do not do very well. So they're sort of the ones I sort of stick towards the end. So I've got one on homelessness today for my third video. And then over next week, I've got ones on issues for disabled people and devolution slated for one of my later videos, but it is also Christmas next week, so I'll have to hope I can get round to them. Otherwise, it'll be after Christmas, or at least after Christmas Day. Anyway, sorry, there was a little comment. Where is it? 72. I don't recognise description of boomers at all. Not anyone I'm associated with. I'm one of the 40%, I suppose. Well, yeah, obviously you don't. It's not. No one. Even when you're part of a demographic, not everyone feels exactly the same way. You know, I sometimes get into trouble when I say, well, you know, the vast majority of older people voted Brexit. Well, I didn't. It's like, well, no, you go to the Rejoin March and there's loads of old people there. And they were old when the referendum was being carried out as well. It's just the vast majority. It's like roughly 70% of older people voted Brexit, but that still means about 30% didn't. They voted to remain. And it's the same thing there. But nonetheless, there are, because it's proportion, isn't it? You've got a first past the post system. So in order to win under that system, in 325-ish constituencies, you need to win more votes than anyone else. You don't have to win half the votes. You have to win a majority of the votes. You just have to win more votes than anyone else in 320 odd constituencies. Ideally 370 odd to get a decent majority. So, you know, if you've got the Conservatives at the moment who are not able to attract those younger voters, and when we say younger voters, at the moment we're talking about people in their 40s, then and this is going to continue because it's, I mean, although I've looked at the housing thing because you can look at that as a graph, but there are also other attitudes. For example, younger people are more likely to be fully seized of the need to address climate change. Just something as simple as that. The Conservatives refuse to, I mean, even when sometimes they acknowledge that climate change is a thing, like anthropogenic climate change, they still don't really think they should do much about it. So they're losing younger voters from that as well. You know, you've got to see, and I think the reason is because if I think back to my schooling, because obviously I went to study physics at university, so I've probably got a better understanding than most people. But you know, even when I think back to like my compulsory education in the 80s when I was at secondary school, so climate change was talked about. I mean, the ozone layer was a big thing there. I suppose the problem with that was we had this problem with the ozone layer, CFCs and all that, and then we fixed it. Like we did a thing really quickly and we fixed it. And it was like, oh, so the idea of a problem that's not as easy to fix is more problematic. But we also had the situation in the 80s where the media were trying to give the impression that the idea of anthropogenic climate change, that is man-made climate change, not natural cycles, was in doubt. Now, it never was in doubt, but the media were giving that impression. Now they don't so much. So I would say probably over the last 20 years, it's been pretty settled. You're not going to learn in school that there's any real debate about it. You are going to be taught that it's a thing and why it's a thing and how damaging it is. So you've now got people in their 40s who, when they were at school, if they listened to science lessons at all, were getting the very strong impression, yeah, there's no debate about this. It's, you know, climate change is serious, it's a thing, and it's caused by these things. So you would naturally then expect, because you want to still be, you don't want, you know, to be under 2 meters of ice in 20 years' time. So you quite like a government that's going to take it seriously. And the Conservatives aren't that. And although Reform UK are appealing to a certain section of younger voters, and not all of whom are just ones who would have ordinarily gone to the Conservatives, but a big block are, Reform UK are not interested in climate change either. They're trying to deny it's even a thing. Richard there said, I remember the late 70s and acid rain. Yeah, I mean, that was another thing that actually we did something about. So there are some, you know, when there's something that's easy to do, even Conservative governments will do it. Because we had a Conservative government, I mean, it wasn't just in the UK we did these, it was globally. But the Conservative government, actually Thatcher's government, did actually take, after a while, it wasn't straight away, acid rain seriously. So we you know, electrostatic smoke precipitators for power stations, things like that. And then, you know, banning CFCs to deal with the ozone layer. So we actually did stuff in the 80s to tackle these things, but that's because it was easy to do. We had there were ways to do it without trashing the economy, whereas now the action needed to deal with climate change in general is much more severe. But that's another issue. And then there's also, I would say, issues on other types of social issues. So, I mean, when you've got like Conservatives for example, saying that people who throw a milkshake at Nigel Farage should be jailed, that people who carry out climate protests. Now, you know, as many of you will know, I'm no fan of Just Stop Oil. I don't see them as climate protesters. I see them as cretins. But nonetheless, a lot of young people will see them as climate protesters, and they'll see Conservatives and Reform UK saying these people who are protesting should be imprisoned, and yet the people who are spreading hate messages shouldn't be imprisoned. And do you know what? That doesn't appeal to a lot of young people either, who have more of a social conscience. It was always the case that young people had a social conscience, but I think that's stretching into middle age as well now. Again, linked with all the other reasons why the Conservatives are no longer appealing to these people. So the billionaires will stop funding the Conservatives and fund instead Reform as something more likely to attract a younger vote, although the outcome will be the same as voting Conservative. Well, no, it won't, because they're at the moment they're splitting the vote. I mean, I don't want to say Reform UK are actually net good, because I don't think they are. I would rather we had a Conservative Party that didn't feel the need to try and keep tilting to the right. But Reform, you know, those, if votes are passing between Conservatives and Reform UK, that's absolutely fine, because what you've got is something that's never existed really for most of my life, which is a right-wing split in the vote. Now, you could argue you had that in 2015 as well. UKIP got a lot of votes. Very scattered. They won one seat. David Cameron massively overblew, and Tory MPs in general, they massively overstated the threat. Whereas now Reform UK they're more professional than UKIP were, even though it's sort of got the same leader. But they're a more professional outfit, and they now have potentially access to much more money. I mean, talking about donations, I saw in the news a former Tory donor who was donating a lot of, I mean millions, a lot of money, not to Reform UK, but to Lawrence Fox's, what is it the Reclaim Party? Like, what's the point in that? But you do at the moment, yeah, you have at the moment very wealthy former Tory donors who are now donating their money to populist groups. Not all of, I mean, Reform UK are the one that's where you're probably going to get the most results. That's weird to me that you would donate to the Reclaim Party. Is that what it's called? I always get it mixed up, don't I? I think it's called the Reclaim Party. And so, yeah, so what that means is the Tories may struggle for more donations as well. And yet they're still the ones with the brand, with the public. So there'll be a lot of the public who will just automatically vote Conservative because they always have. And the Conservatives are still a party. And the Conservatives, because they have way more MPs than Reform UK, and they still will after the next election, they're still going to be seen as the established right-wing party. So that's why Reform UK at the moment are trying to claim that they can win the next election. I did that video earlier today about that. It was a draw. It wasn't a graph. It was a drawing. Someone just did that. It was just made to look like a graph. It had no data points on it. It had two that were rubbish. So yeah, the reason they're doing that is they're trying to persuade people that actually they're trying to persuade people that the Conservatives cannot win the next election, which is actually true, and you could get people to believe that. But they are trying to say, but we can, which is also not true. But they're trying to persuade people of that. And that just means that they are going to carry on splitting that vote. And it means that at the next election, as long as Labour actually deliver what is an obvious standard of living increase to the key people, to key voters, you could well end up with the right wing being extremely split at the next election. Could produce some very interesting results. And I am interested in seeing where it goes from there, because this has not really happened, certainly not before 2015. But it hasn't really happened to this extent before now, because it's always been the case in my life that the right-wing vote was pretty much, so, you know, the centre-right, okay, you'd have a bit of fight over that. But mostly the right-wing vote was sewn up by the Conservatives. Like, if you're on the right wing, if you were very clearly right-wing, you voted Conservative. If the Conservatives were particularly obnoxious at the time, you might vote Lib Dem. That was it. Whereas, and if you were pragmatic, maybe a few people voted Labour. Whereas on the left, you had Labour having to compete in the centre with the Lib Dems and the Conservatives, having to compete on the left with the the Greens and SNP implied, and a few other smaller parties who would have no chance of winning a seat, but could nonetheless take a few crucial hundreds of votes off you. Last time the right-wing vote was split was 1906. Yeah, well, that would be when the Liberal Party won, after the Tories massively messed up over the Boer War. Yeah, and then the Liberal Party, of course, started to disappear and Labour started to emerge. But yeah, so in my lifetime, this is quite new. So yeah, the next 10 years should be quite interesting. I'd rather we didn't have it. It's very much like the "May you live in interesting times" curse, isn't it? Not interesting necessarily in a good way, but it will be interesting to see how it all works out. For example, if Reform UK, I mean, if they're going on saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to win the election, we can absolutely win the election," and then at the next election, let's say they win 20 seats, which is a massive increase, but it's like still pathetic. And if that's what they get, then it will be interesting to see how the right wing respond to that, because then it'll be like, if Reform UK have had this huge surge of momentum, they've had a free rein because the Conservatives basically stepped aside for them, and they still, all they managed to get for it is like 20 seats. The right wing could have a proper meltdown. It could be quite entertaining. I hope it's more entertaining than horrifying, but we will have to see. But anyway, go through the last few comments. Could run out of time there. Learn about paleontology from a very early age has given me a really good understanding of major climatic and geological events, which is why I think it should be taught at secondary school. There's quite a few things that should be taught. Like, the problem with our education, it's too general. There are things we really should teach that are very important. And let's face facts. Even people who get decent GCSE, so I mean, even people who work hard at school and they get decent GCSE grades, 6 months later, I know this as a teacher, 6 months later, they've forgotten it. Like, I've had A-level students, so they're studying the subject they're really interested in. They did really well in their GCSE. And yet, your first few weeks with them, teaching them A-levels, they've only just, literally a few months before, done their GCSEs and got really good grades. And they've forgotten so much. And these are bright students who are really interested in that. So how much do you think people who are not that interested in the first place forget? So what's the point of teaching them a massive breadth curriculum when most people don't remember it? You should really hammer the stuff that's really very important. But anyway, there it is. There it is. Pronator, they're saying UKIP got 12.6% to only 15, Reform 14.3% here. Not much of an increase over 10ish years. No, exactly. Exactly. It's not much of an increase. They did use it to better effect, and they may use it to better effect next time. But, the idea that they're going to end up getting something like 25% of the vote at the next election. I mean, I'm not going to try and gaze into my crystal ball because I don't have one. But I do think it's, if people are going to suggest that Reform UK are going to get 25% of the vote at the next election, I'm going to say two things. First of all, I'm going to say, yeah, I'll believe that when I see it. And secondly, that still won't win them the election. But anyway, we'll leave it there. We're back on together tomorrow with another one. Thanks very much for coming on, everyone. Have a great rest of afternoon. And until next time, I'll see you later.